Yes. So Ashima or Nakia, Muskan, have you ever tried translating something?
Yes, so usually when wait, my voice is okay. Usually when my parents ask me to translate something from English to their native language, like our mother tongue, then usually I do translate.
Right. And what's your experience of that? What do you feel about the translated text? What are the problems or struggles that are involved in translation?
Yes, sir. So I think the biggest limitation of translation is that you can't exactly translate it.
Mm-hmm.
You getting my point? Like when so I see a lot of people talking about how someone is translating something from their native language to English, but that's not the exact same thing that is getting translated. So because of that, I think that is one of the limitations that
That there is lack of exactness, right? That
yeah, exactly.
what's means you're translated from English to Gujarati? Ashima?
Usually for me, yeah, I don't speak Gujarati, I speak Punjabi.
Okay.
So a lot of things that so because every language has their own meanings behind it. Sometimes even English can have its limits, and then but at the same time our language has already has a word or a meaning for a word, for an emotion or something. So because of that, that space is hollow and that needs to be filled. So
Means what
translation
space?
helps that, but
Can
at
you
the
be
same
more
time it has
precise?
its limits.
Ashima, can you be more precise about the space which remains hollow? Because that is a very interesting observation.
Okay, so let me process. So the space that I'm talking about is the lake of tools that is there between translation, because one language has their own history of their own history as a language, and the
Right.
other language has their own history. So
Yeah.
there needs to be bridge that gaps between them. So
Right.
so it can be difficult, it can be tricky as a if we look at it from translation studies, their lenses, it is difficult to bridge that gap. So that can be the limitation, because first of all, if we are learning a new language, it it takes a lot of effort to learn a language, first of all. And sometimes what a native means is trying to say is not something that we have learned as well, because that is not our a native language. We have learned this language from a very young age. So
Are you
compared
speaking
to
about
the
English,
person who's learning,
Ashima? Are you speaking about English
no
as
no
like an acquired language or?
no, it doesn't. Then if we talk about English only, then it will be very limited. If we are learning about like if we are learning a language, for example German, what a
Right.
German experience is in that language is very different from ours. If we are learning that language, it will take a lot of time for us to understand it, because we need the right tools to understand that language. So
And what are those
at
tools?
some time,
And what are those tools?
what are those tools of learning a language?
Whatever, yeah. Tools in the sense.
Uh, so first of all, how एक मिनट क्या हो रहा है?
Sorry.
क्या हुआ? या मुस्कान से
Yeah.
हाँ
Hi, Muskan.
हाँ
You are
ओके,
better
वो मैं
now?
बाद में बोलती हूँ, ठीक है?
Muskan, you are better?
Yeah.
Now you can
So I
speak?
can't speak.
No, it doesn't matter.
No, she can't speak.
No, that's fine. उसका नाम मुस्कान है, इसलिए उसकी मुस्कान लोगों ने सी के बंद कर दी है. Yeah, go on. Yeah. Continue. Ashima.
Yeah, Nakia wants to speak.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
Nakia.
So, okay. So what was your question?
My
Sir,
question
I
was
don't want
regarding
to
the
say
tools.
anything.
Okay, regarding the tools of when you learn a different language, a new language, it takes a lot of time, and you require tools of certain kinds. So I was curious to find out which tools are you specifically talking about. I'm trying to figure out what you are saying, because your observations are very important, and I'm sure what you said, many others in the class can also identify with these problems, right? What you have said. Nakia, what can you add, or do you agree with what Ashima said? One of the things that she is saying, that
Yeah,
few
sir.
languages you don't find the exact translation or exact equivalent, if the term is to be used. There is lack of exact equivalence, and also emotions in one language, you don't find exact equivalence in another language. Histories of languages are very different, plus our own experience of acquisition of language, like some languages that require a lot of hard work to acquire. So our relation with all the languages is not same. If I understand what Ashima is trying to say, that for her Punjabi may be the first
Yes, sir.
language,
Yes,
but to
sir.
learn German she has to put in a lot of efforts and acquire. So when it comes to translation, such language can pose more difficulties. Am I right, Ashima?
Yes, sir. Exactly.
Right. So what do you think based on your experience, Nakia?
So, so I'll agree with Ashima, especially when it comes to that space that is created. There's this void between the two. Like, let's say you're translating from one language to another. So I did this exercise just to pass the time. So when I finished one of my assignments on Google Docs, there's this option where you can auto translate it to another language. So I tried doing it in Hindi, from English to Hindi, and then I did it from English to Urdu, and I saw like how different those two translations are also from each other, the Hindi one and the Urdu one, though those two languages are so closely related to each other. As well as, of course, between English and Hindi there is this huge gap, but even between Hindi and Urdu there was this gap uh, of it's the same thing I was trying to convey, but there was this gap between both of them when I read the Hindi version versus when I read the Urdu version. So
Hindi
sir,
and
I
Urdu
think what Ashima pointed out
yeah, go ahead.
about that void that is there because of the difference in the way you perceive things. So that's something that I have noticed a lot of the times in translation as well. Like, for example, of course now I do not know Japanese, but I'm reading a Japanese novel that has been translated into English, or a Japanese short story that's been translated into English. I do feel this sense of disconnect there, because for example, when I'm watching something, a Japanese anime or a Japanese movie, at that time when they're speaking, the kind of emotions that they're emoting, what I can see the actors or the characters, the way the artist has done, it's very different from when I read it simply in English.
Are you talking
So
about
there is this gap
Titan?
that Ashima spoke about. No, sir, anything. I have not watched that one.
Okay.
So I'm very behind when it comes to anime. I cannot watch too much at one go. So I don't watch too much.
Right. So basically there is a disconnect, even when a language is as similar as Urdu and Hindi. Means Hindi and Urdu are same languages. It is called Hindustani. And when one is written with more Perso-Arabic vocabulary in Nastaliq script, it is called Urdu. And if it draws upon Sanskritized vocabulary, right, and written in Devanagari, it is called Hindi. So actually it is the same language called Hindustani. And it has got two forms called Urdu and Hindi. And in linguistic, I think it is called diglossia. यानी एक ही भाषा दो स्वरूपों में रहती है, two forms. And Hindi and Urdu are diglossic with Hindustani, which is the base language of both these languages. So in spite of translating from one form of language to another form of the same language, like Hindi and Urdu, you have so much gap and differences. And Naki also talked about perception. That perception also changes. So is it true that perception is also connected to language in some way? Our perception.
Yeah, sir.
So how in what way do you think perceptions differ because of language, or are affected by language?
So, okay, so one example, and this is something that actually happened with us in real life. So we were just having a conversation between like the four of us, and we were talking about, it was a funny conversation, and I think Ashima said, I think Sir Puneet sir said that yeah, it's a scapegoat, and then Ashima said कि हाँ बलि का बकरा है. So the two ideas, they mean the exact same thing, but they are so different the way you imagine it. Like scapegoat is just, at least in my opinion, it sounds like the scandal and this kind of, a plan that has been created to make someone a
Scapegoat sounds too sinister.
But Bali
Bali ka bakra is what happens to you every day.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like if someone is the butt of the joke, so then they become a Bali ka bakra. So the perception, even though they are meaning the same thing, in fact, the word scapegoat and Bali ka bakra both have this goat relation with it. Yet the image in my mind that is created.
कभी-कभी बकरा भी एक ही होता है.
And
बकरा एक ही होता है. दो languages में आप उसकी बात कर रहे हो. Even then it sounds so
that is, yeah, exactly. And so that is like the perception in my head about these two words that mean the same thing is completely different. So I think that is what I understand by perception.
Very good. Muskan, do you have something to add? You can type it if you want, if you can't speak.
Ashima, you are on mute.
Ashima, I think, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think the
Can you hear me now?
issues are a problem. Yeah. You are audible now.
Okay. So even with regional languages, there are times when there's a perception of, so for example, there is a thing called kotha. It has negative connotations usually in Hindi, but in Punjabi language, there's a thing called koti, which means a bungalow, a row house or a bungalow.
Koti is even
and also a terrace. So
Koti yani chota bangla is kind of.
yeah.
Koti is,
and koti also means chat, like upar chat mein jana. So how even a perception of a language, a word changes from language to language is interesting to notice, especially in Indian languages, because we all have, sometimes we mean the same thing, but with different languages, and sometimes a word has different meanings in different languages.
Very good. So if you just put all the things that you have been discussing together, then you have almost sum up all the difficulties and issues involved in translation as an activity, right? One of the issues is not finding exact equivalence, and that is largely because of differences in cultural histories and the emotions and perceptions that are associated with each language. So difference and the lack of exactness is the basic issue that bothers us whenever we have to translate. So what happens in translation when you are not able to find an exact equivalent? What are you left with? what is your experience of it? Suppose you have translated something and you know that it's not exact. So what is your experience about it? What do you feel about it?
So
First of all,
can you explain the question?
My question is that you are now aware that of the difficulties that are involved in translation, that there is lack of exact equivalence. And largely that is because of different cultural histories that languages have. And it's also because of emotions and perceptions that each language is associated with. So even if the word is the same, and Balika Bakra translated as scapegoat or scapegoat translated Balika Bakra are equivalents, in spite of this equivalence being there, there is still great difference between the two. Right? So Balika Bakra is more or less accurate equivalent to scapegoat. But even then, in spite of having this equivalence, there is still something that it lacks. Right? Balika Bakra has this more informality and casualness, while scapegoat has this whole connotation of sinister, scheming, what is going on at the back kind of thing, right? Somebody being targeted. So it has got this whole associations of scheming, plotting, intrigue, and sinister things, which is missing in Balika Bakra, which is a very everyday conversational thing, right? टीचर का झगड़ा हो गया अपने बीवी के साथ और हम लोगों को बलि का बकरा बनना पड़ा, right? So it's everyday kind of experience that you know. So even if there is equivalence, there is no exactness, right? And there are words which are similar in languages, but though they are similar in regional languages, they are used in a different way to mean different things, right? So you can see this difference is the word that we have been using in terms of cultural history, in terms of associations, right? And in terms of perceptions, in terms of emotional association with the words or the language. So translation as an activity or process is involved in this kind of negotiation that is ongoing between a set of two languages which are inherently not equivalent, right? So lack of equivalence is what necessitates translation in the first place, right? If two languages were exactly identical, do you think you would need translation at all? Right? So what necessitates translation is the lack of equivalence. And what makes it impossible is also the same thing, right? Having said that, how many of you have to rely on translations in your life?
So all the time we have to rely.
All the time, for example?
Yeah. So if we are reading a book, like if, for example, I'm interested in some XYZ culture, let's say Japanese or Korean or some culture where English is not their predominant language. So they will write in Japanese. The only way for me to access that their writing or their literature is through translation. Or something that is more relatable is like when you're watching a movie. So the subtitles, they are, though we are watching it in the original language, the subtitles are a form of translation. So we never know what exactly the character is saying. So for example, I was watching this movie, I was watching Rang De Vasanti on Netflix, and Kiran Kher, she's saying that she's being the typical Punjabi mother who is trashing her child for not coming and meeting her in that scene, and she calls him something Ullu ka patta, something, it goes on and on. But in the translation, it's just that, why don't you come and meet me? So it's not the same thing at all. So but yeah, like, I'm not reliant because I can understand that, but now somebody watching would be reliant. The same way if I watch, let's say for example, I I don't understand Tamil or Telugu. So I'm 100% reliant on the translation. So at least for personally for me, I'm completely reliant on that to explore other
Even
cultures or
religious
to
scriptures we have to
just for
rely
my
on
entertainment need.
religious
Yeah,
scriptures also.
exactly.
Like which religious books do you have to rely on translation?
So the original Bible, because it was written in Hebrew, then
Hmm.
even Quran, it's in Arabic, and I don't like for personally, I don't understand Arabic. So if I want to know the meaning of something, it has to be translated.
And what is translation called? Translation called in Arabic, Persian में क्या कहते हैं Arabic or translation?
So I don't know what translation is called, but translator is mutarjim, like that is the word for
Can you
translator.
come again? Can you come again? What is it called?
So mutarjim, that is the word for
Mutarjim.
translate.
Okay. And there is a term called tarjuma. Have you
Yeah,
heard
so
of?
that is the so it's
The
the
person
same
who
rule.
does the tarjuma is the person, right? Okay. Guru Granth Sahib, Ashima was saying, is in translation.
Yes, so it is written in Punjabi, but if we want to read it and you do not know Punjabi as a like a written language, then they will translate it into Hindi or English for you. And even
So
in their
you could read it in Punjabi or in translation.
someone translate. Hanji?
Ashima, do you read the
Yes,
text
sir.
in translation or in Punjabi original?
Sir, I don't read it. I'm Hindu Punjabi. I'm not Sikh Punjabi. So it's not like my book.
It's not your scripture. Okay, right. But again, the interesting question we have not raised, in Nakia's case as well as Ashima, is multiplicity of scripts. Nakia can read the Arabic Quran, but she doesn't understand a word of it, or she understands some words of it, which is even worse than not understanding a word of it, right? But the
Yeah,
script
so true.
remains
That
the
is
same.
worse.
हाँ? ऐसे ही होता है
So
थोड़ा
you are
बहुत.
right. That is worse. हाँ, when you know
in
थोड़ा
Hindi,
बहुत and not.
हिंदी में एक कहावत है, नीम हकीम खतरे जान. जो
So
नीम
what does
हकीम
that
होता है,
mean?
हकीम जो होता है ना पूरी तरह से पढ़ा लिखा हो तो जान को खतरा नहीं होता, मगर जो नीम यानी आधा पौना पहली साल MBBS में वो मानो या फर्स्ट ईयर की पढ़ाई कर रहा है तो नीम हकीम है वो, तो जान के लिए खतरा बन सकता है. सो not knowing is not a problem, but थोड़ा बहुत जानना is far more dangerous. So the point that I'm making is that the script is a very interesting issue. Punjabi has two scripts. One is Gurmukhi and the other is the Nastaliq Urdu script that is used in Urdu, in Arabic, in Persian, as well as in Punjabi. Right. So there are two scripts for Punjabi. And huge amount of Punjabi population is found in Pakistan. And they use that script. While people over this side of boundary are far more conversant with the Gurmukhi script. The question that we are discussing is of cultural differences in spite of similarities. So the questions of similarities, differences, fake similarities, right, are abound when we start looking at the whole phenomena of translation closely. How much are we reliant upon it, and how much we know that even if it is exact, it is not exact. So we are left with this whole question of loss involved in translation, right? So even if you have managed to translate something from one language to another, there is an experience of loss, and that is the question that I was trying to ask you. But even if you manage to translate it,
So
but still, yeah.
So
Nakia.
can you so you said something about fake similarity. Can you explain that?
जैसे कि बलि का बकरा and scapegoat are similar, but their associational, connotational, what should I say, meanings differ. when you say somebody is a scape, you're talking of Jews being scapegoats during the World War, right? Means they are targeted and all the blame is shifted on their head and they are tormented and they are killed during the Nazi Germany. And you find such community, there would be many communities, not just Jews, who are treated as scapegoats, right? So scapegoat has this whole connotation of sinister planning, scheming, intrigue, deception. While Balika Bakra, even if it means the same thing, sacrificial goat, it means something which is far more lighter and everyday, right? So the weight associated with both the meanings differ even if they are same thing, right? So in spite of sameness, there is no sameness, right? In spite of the fact that both talk about the same thing, they are not really talking about the same thing. So that is what I meant by fake kind of similarities. So the whole discussion that we have been having based on our own experiences as translator point to the fact that translation is something of, you have to rely upon it at the same time. It's never going to be original. It's going to be inaccurate, approximate, kind of compromise rather than genuine accessing of that language, right? So this kind of association of negativity that we have about translation, right, is one of the reasons why we don't take translation seriously in the study of literature. We have not yet started discussing translation of poetry, right, where meanings of words are always that people play with the meanings of the word and puns and all that.
So even the translator's bias, like if I am translating somewhere what I think, what I interpret a poem or a text to be, I will translate it according to that.
Very true. And that's why translation is never seen as a perfect one ever. So all this understanding of translation as something like compromise, as something as deception, right? It may actually involve translators' own prejudice creeping in and we don't know about it, right? So all this led to a kind of marginalization of translation in study of literature and culture because of all this negative associations and understandings of translation. However, at the same time, most of the things that we study, even in English literature, rely upon translations. For example, if you look at history of criticism in English, right? If you look at English literary criticism, right, you begin with what? What do you start studying English literary criticism with?
Sir, Plato.
Plato and Aristotle and Longinus, for example. Socrates is again actually Plato's mouthpiece in his dialogues.
Yeah.
But these are in Greek, right? And we are talking of 2,500 years ago, the language of that Greece, right? It is not English. So what we are reading about Plato in our study of English literature is either a commentary on Plato in English or it is a translation of his texts, right? So we are anyway relying upon translations. Though we know that there can be translators' prejudice, there is essentially a lack of equivalence at the heart of the activity, which necessitates translation in the first place. In spite of all this knowledge, we have to rely on this, right? For example, Longinus was translated into French in 17th century, and from French by somebody called Nicolas Boulou it was then brought into English by, I think, by none other than Alexander Pope himself. So neoclassical movement that happens in English literary criticism relies on the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, Longinus all the time. And the Neoplatonic philosophers like Plotinus and Macrobius, I don't know if you've heard of these names, are major presences in English formation of English literary criticism, whose first important scholar is John Dryden. Right? You heard of John Dryden, a great neoclassical scholar.
Yes, sir.
And he
He
was.
did his work as well.
What did you study by Dryden?
McFlecknoe and
Okay.
Epsilon में पता नहीं कुछ क्या
Absalom and Achitophel.
क्या था?
Absalom and
Yeah.
Achitophel.
हाँ,
Roman
that.
Achitophel.
But in criticism, did you study Dryden?
No, sir.
That English literary criticism begins. He is called, for some reason, father of English literary criticism. For some reasons, I have never understood. Because he seems to be practicing criticism way it is practiced nowadays. So in some way, he is first initiator of criticism. And it is not very surprising because he is drawing upon neoclassical canons formulated by Plato, Aristotle, Ovid, Virgil, and Homer, and Cicero, and Horace. He's drawing upon their ideas, that he is also the most important translator in English. Right? And he is also one of the first theorists of translation. So the first theory of translation in English language is found in Dryden. So Dryden is also the father of translation studies in English. Yeah, ये father mother वाला jumla है actually. But you may say that he is one of the first person, a kind of inaugural figure in establishing theorization of translation, which is extremely influential even today. And he says in his very interesting preface to Ovid, Ovid is a neo-Augustan, he's Augustan poet. And Metamorphosis is a very famous book by Ovid, where Dryden translates it and writes a preface saying that translation there are three methods of translating. First is what he calls paraphrase, right? And you know what is paraphrase? That you are not translating something freely, but broadly. You are paraphrasing someone. The second way of translating is what he calls imitation, something that he himself is doing. And finally, metaphrase means word by word literal translation. And all translators, according to Dryden, have to strike a balance between metaphrase and paraphrase. You have to steer between these two extremes. And that is what we often do in translation. So whenever we find that it's not possible to stick to exact equivalents, or if they are not available, we broadly find approximate equivalents to it. Right? So we are paraphrasing something. But at the same time, in literature, it's not sufficient that you paraphrase. You also have to convey literary qualities of those texts. So you have to imitate something, and imitation is the term he uses. And imitation is one of the most important terms in classical thought in the West. And the Greek term for this is mimesis, or imitation, right? And mimesis was in ancient Greece, before Plato, pre-Socratic times, was implied how one performer performed Homer, right? How one singer, rhapsode, would perform Homer. And for him to perform Homer in particular way, he had a model of earlier performance, And so he had to stick close to that. And this kind of fidelity to a model was called mimesis in those days. So I'm sure you've heard of the term mimesis, right? In your criticism class?
Yeah, sir, we have.
Yes,
Right.
sir.
So mimesis or imitation, which is at the heart of neoclassical literary scholarship in English, right, comes from Greek. And imitation जो शब्द है वो ही translation है mimesis का. Mimesis ये Greek word है जिसका translation English translation imitation है. So you can see that English literary criticism in some way is a translation of Greek and Roman criticism. Right? So translation is, though it is considered minor activity or something that is filled with a lot of problems that we have discussed, in spite of that, it has played a role of laying foundation of nothing less than English literary criticism in the United Kingdoms. It is founded on the ideas of translation. That's the point I'm trying to make. So even if people neglect translation, you have to use translation to lay your foundation stone. Okay, now there is only less than 1 minute left in this 40 minutes Zoom meeting. So we will be signing off and we'll be signing in again. There is some problem with my Google Meet, so I have to do this whole exercise.
So if you want, then like one of us can make the Google Meet link. We can try on that.
Yeah, you can try on that, please. So once this goes out, you can
So
send.
I'll
You
I will
generate
send
that
the
link.
link.
Yeah. Let's see.